Hi everyone, for today's featured ship we're going to be checking out the Shadyside. How this ship hasn't had a documentary about it or even a book written about it defies belief. This ship has lived a full life. For over 50 years it was featured on the East Coast. Not only was it a very speedy paddler, it was involved in everything from having its own wanted poster, to being employed by the New York police force, to being operated by a company that undercut the competitors, and competition was so intense that the competitors would actually put up fences and even beat the passengers that tried to get onto this ship. It would ultimately end its days rotting away, and had events proven otherwise, its last employer was Garvey, owner of the Black Star Line, one of the last ships that they bought before that dramatic company also imploded. Chances are the remains of this ship are now buried under the mud because it was just left to rot, but that is yet to be determined. The crazy life of the Shadyside began in 1873, and its vital statistics are as follows. The Shadyside was 168 feet long, which equates to 51 meters. It had a beam or a width of 27 feet, which equates to 8 meters. And the gross tonnage was 444, with passenger capacity originally being 600 and then ultimately increasing to 700 later on in its life. Shadyside was originally operated by the Marciana Steamboat Company, and to commemorate their new ship, it was painted by the Bard brothers, and a beautiful painting is included in this book that covers the Bard brothers' rather distinctive work. The ship serviced Upper Manhattan and the Bronx, and I think it's just human nature. And I think it's just human nature that whenever two companies or two individuals are involved in the same trade, competition is going to happen. And in this case, it was racing. Paddle steamers racing each other with the intensity that rivaled the more famous Mississippi races. In this particular instance, the Shadyside's arch nemesis was the Sylvian Dell, and at one point the races got so intense that the captain of the Sylvian Dell attached a plank of wood across the ship so that the Shadyside could not overtake. As a middle finger towards the Sylvian Dell, the captain of the Shadyside was able, in a remarkable and rather risky example of seamanship, was able to turn the Shadyside around and nip the plank of wood off the Sylvian Dell. Thankfully, the ships did not collide, no one was hurt, but the captains involved were all censured and were told, don't do that again, because that could lead to a disaster, and nobody wants a disaster, because they're bad for profits. The ship's original route was taken over by a railway. And so in 1881, the ship was sold to the New York City Police, who initially planned to make it into a police vessel. However, this never eventuated, and it would be interesting to understand what the idea was there, whether it was going to be a floating police station or a patrol vessel. It's unclear. But it was then sold to another company who operated the ship to Staten Island. And here things got ugly, because the fares were cheaper than the competition by a grand total of 5 cents, and we're talking 1880s here, so 5 cents was quite a considerable saving. And employees of the other companies would try to boycott the dock where the ship would come into moor, sometimes casting away the ropes, and in one instance there are reports that they even beat the passengers that were trying to board the ship. Of course, that got very ugly, and so the extreme circumstance was that they even put up fences to prevent people from getting onto the Shadyside. There had been no common agreement of set fares, which is why this particular company was undercutting, and while they were initially successful, long-term, the costs just didn't add up, and the ship ran at a loss. The ship's notoriety continued. While attempting in 1883 to operate along the Delaware River, the ship again continued operating at a loss and disappeared. The captain stopped operating the ship, and for a while a wanted poster had been placed in the New York Times thinking that the ship had been moved over to New York. Again, information is scant, and it would be fascinating to know exactly what the machinations there were that led to the ship being moved away and causing it to be made wanted. Which is ironic, considering that this ship had also been at one point bought by the New York police force. These turbulent times finally eased up in 1886 when the ship was employed to operate between New York and Stamford in Connecticut. How long it did so is open to debate. Some say up until 1901, some say up until 1921. 1921 would make sense because at that point it was purchased by Marcus Garvey to be added to his exotic fleet of older vessels for his ambitious company, the Black Star Line. More on that and more on his fleet of ships coming up in another episode. But the Shadyside never operated as such with the Black Star Line. The company was wound up shortly after the ship was purchased, and by then the ship was almost 50 years old, thoroughly worn out, and so the ship was simply tucked away on the mudflats and allowed to rot. And as far as I know, and I would love to hear if anyone is aware, but my understanding is that the wreck was then just basically buried in the mud, and to all intents and purposes remains there to this day. And such ends the very active, very notorious life of the Shadyside, a vessel that had at one point been not only employed by the New York police, but had its own wanted poster in the New York Times. A ship that had been very fast, very elegant, very maneuverable, but had also been operated by some audacious and cunning individuals, ending its days ignominiously tucked away in a mudflat. Had the economy been different, it could have been an interesting addition to the Black Star Line fleet, but it was not to be. Of course, the Shadyside had already made its mark, and many vessels on the East Coast, particularly the paddlers, had maybe not as dramatic a life as this vessel, but certainly the times from the 1870s to the 1930s were dramatic, and I would encourage you to dive in and learn more about these fascinating ships, of which the Shadyside was just but one.